Today we are going to talk about the case of the girl Isabella shocked Brazil. Thank you for coming here. Sit finger on the like and subscribe to the channel for YouTube brings send notification when new movie comes out. It happened on the bridge. You are being filmed. TV that he went down with half of him. I already did the champagne and the speech was to raise everything, only metal screen for the and then they said I don't address the facts. On Santa Leocadia Street there was an attempted robbery, then a child was thrown from the apartment on the 6th floor. The bloodstains indicated that the child had already entered injured, so she wasn't injured inside the apartment. Statistically, 50% of cases of falls from the 5th and 6th floors can survive, and Isabella had a 50% chance of surviving if immediate care had been provided, but the previous asphyxia. And on Saturday, March 29th, I was on duty. The shift started at 8 p.m. The shift was calm until atypical for a Saturday night, around midnight. A little later, already on Sunday, already on the 30th, 2 police officers went to my office and informed me about the crime. They said there was an attempted robbery, then a child was thrown from the 6th floor apartment. The first call to the COPM, to the 190 of the military police, was made by the resident of the 1st floor, maybe of military emergency, at the corner of Rua Santa Leocadia, 13 and then, thief in the building, throwing a child from the top, for God's sake. I had the case number 138 with 387. They threw someone from the top, answer for God's sake, throwing a child from up here for God's sake, in the building, it was my God in heaven. And I'm so emotional, I'm singing along with him, for God's sake, daughter. Subsequently, other residents, as they were growing up there, in front of the building where the child was, or were arriving, not in the building, the residents seeing that scene also called. Other people who heard from the neighboring buildings the desperate screams of the people in front of the building also called. You can read in the recordings we received from the military police, the food always, and look, we already have these calls, and I think one of the reasons there were so many patrol cars at the scene was this volume of calls that there were 3 fire trucks, practically 15-20 military police patrol cars, and despite dozens of calls that were made to the military police and the fire department, none of them from Alexander or Ana Carolina Jatoba were considered in common. And this I questioned the couple in the first conversation I had with them at the police station, and the answer they had at the time was to explain to me that it was a family habit, not to first make a call to their own parents.
Hey you who are watching a movie. I see that you didn't leave your like and didn't subscribe to the channel. Give me this strength for me to bring more content to you. Thank you.
To their family members, and not to ask for help from the fire department. And then I questioned them again. Okay, you called her father, and then why didn't you ask for help? And they said it didn't cross their minds. They didn't have that instinctive reaction to try to save Isabella's life. And this occurrence, between around 3 in the morning, 2-3 in the morning, I saw a forensic expert on duty. He went to the scene and from there he already contacted me. Look, I'm seeing some things here differently, but we're going to do with this case, but even by phone, I was already able to give some guidance, right? From that moment on, I entered the case. And when I arrived at the building, Alexander and Ana Carolina were no longer there. She had already gone to Guarulhos with her family, and he accompanied his father in the rescue. He went with his father to Santa Casa. I had already arrived at the scene. There were still military police officers doing their job, the residents, the crowd, the rivers. Only when I was leaving the building did Alexander arrive, accompanied by his father as well. They didn't know who they were. Then the military policeman said, "Oh, it's the child's father and his father, right?" And together they came to talk to me. The first conversation I had with him was a question from him. Did you catch the thief? Did they arrest the thief? Then he asked me if he could go up to the apartment to get some clothes to change, and I said no, that only after the expertise was carried out, the end of the expertise, and it would be released for the family to return. After I was at the building, I went to Santa Casa because I needed to see the victim, see the injuries she had. The people said that she had arrived lifeless, so there were no medical procedures at the hospital. When I saw Isabella, I was even surprised because I knew she had fallen from the 6th floor, about 20 meters. So, the idea I had was to find a person with several injuries, very different from the way I found her. She didn't look like a victim of such a barbaric crime. She looked like an angel sleeping. And then the apartment, the first time I went in, you already have the view. It's a corridor that gives access to the first dining room, then a TV room, and then there's a balcony, and the view you have, giving entrance to this corridor, you could already see blood drops. They were small drops, a distance from each other, practically a distance as if it were from an adult's step. Analyzing the first photographs of the scene, it was already possible to have a first impression. We already realized that something was not consistent with the story that was being presented, that this child had been left in the apartment, and then the father went down to pick up the other children. When he came back he saw a cut in the screen, and his son was already there in the garden, right? She was thrown out the window. This story, you and also turning inside the apartment, that there was disorganization in all the rooms. This we can even suggest that the couple was not living in harmony, that they were somehow frustrated, unhappy, by the appearance of the apartment, of someone who is dissatisfied, but no type of disturbance was observed that suggested that indicated a physical fight inside the apartment. There were no fallen furniture, broken furniture, out of place, that you could conclude that there was a physical fight because of Bella. She came to us here at the Institute with an attempted robbery where an unknown individual entered the apartment to invade and ended up throwing a child from the 6th floor. That was the story we had. So, it characterizes what? A crime against property? Someone went there to throw a child, and not only went there to take something of value from that apartment, so if we find the drawers open, the entire contents removed, scattered on the floor, this indicates a search. Someone who is really looking for something of value among the drawers of clothes, fishing equipment, jewelry, isn't that right? This characterizes the search. Isn't that what we found in that apartment? Another thing that was observed was that there was no forced entry of the door was intact. So, you also, as a professional, already come to some conclusions, because for someone to have access, and there is no forced entry, this person necessarily had to have a family closeness or be someone from that bond of that family. And since there was no forced entry, the person in need to have this ease of access to that apartment and that building. And then we have to analyze the crime scene, the scene as a whole, so it's not just the bloodstain or any other trace that draws in the context of that scene, the characteristics of that disorder, which was not a routine habit of that family. So in a scene where there were numerous pieces of clothing to wash, you pass me, but it only caught the attention, obviously, a single diaper in the bucket, right? That was washed, because that diaper always existed, countless others there from the beginning. You discard the possibility of an accidental fall of the child, being playing and ending up going out through that window, first because there were protective screens, second because the screen is very firm, it's even difficult for an adult to cut. So, a child Isabella's age, who was 5 years old, did not have the capacity, did not have the physical conditions to cut that screen the way it was done. And then, look, there are two very interesting aspects regarding the bloodstains. The first, already indicated that the victim entered the apartment injured. She was injured in another location, not inside the apartment. This was one aspect. The other is that we observed that these stains were partially removed. Even with the naked eye we observed, they presented characteristics of partial removal, which indicates that someone tried to clean, but didn't have enough time to do a cleaning, and didn't even manage to visualize the stain to the point of removing it. So, the reagent was important for that, wasn't it, to really demonstrate that these stains were partially removed. And then we move on to the search, right? Where exactly was this child injured? So we examined the building as a whole, all the floors, the garages, and then we reached a vehicle, found bloodstains, Isabella's blood, and in forensic work, the two big moments, aren't they, the initial report, where we have these traces, and there, from the traces found at the scene and the traces found in the pieces of examination, mainly the shirt worn by the defendant, isn't it? We were able to establish the dynamics, and that's how it happened. She didn't enter through the door, she was placed in a certain place, then she was transported, by the bed, and she was thrown out the window. This is a moment later, the simulated reproduction work, the most important thing was to establish the timeline. We only had access to very important information from witnesses who spoke about where she was, all the data from the telephone company, COPM, military police, rescue, right? From the GPS itself. So with that we were able to establish the timeline, and putting all this data together, we were able to establish the real dynamics. And then you have to establish a bond, you have to establish a motivation for the crime, a bond between whoever committed the crime and the victim to justify and explain why he wanted to commit such a barbaric crime. So I questioned the couple about enemies, about threats, about revenge, and they, seeing that it would be necessary to find an explanation for this fact, at first they said, so it could have been a service provider for the building, and I asked why they raised this suspicion. The explanation was that this person from the building looked at Isabella in a strange way. That was the only explanation, just because she looked at Isabella strangely, wanting to kill the child, going to kill the child. It's not enough reason. They said then that it could have been another service provider who went to install an antenna, all these people who they would plant. These names we already identified on Monday. We heard from all the people in 2 days of investigation. We heard from 23 people. We heard from people who frequented the Nardoni family's house and people who were neighbors for a few years of the couple in the old building. These people brought us information about the couple's behavior, like the fact that they were used to arguments. In the arguments they swore that they got to the point of assaulting each other, extreme jealousy, mainly from Jatoba in relation to Ana Oliveira, that during one of the couple's fights, she herself during the fight broke the glass of one of the windows with her hand, punching the apartment, and in the first statements they reported what they had done that Saturday. Both gave the idea of a couple who had a very harmonious life, very quiet, full of love, different from other people who were hurt and from other cases that I have already investigated. It is normal, natural for people to question, why did someone do this? Why does someone have the ability to kill a child? What happened to my son? They don't question anything, they don't have any doubts about anything, they practically don't even talk about Isabella. From the beginning, from the first conversation, the story was that there was a thief, he entered the apartment, the thief rope, the thief threw Isabella. The story was not told from beginning to end. They didn't have any doubts, they didn't ask any questions. The police, and they already stated that nothing had been taken from the apartment, and if they thought they were sure they would find Isabella fallen, they would already be sure that nothing had been taken from the apartment. Among the details they told in the interrogation that we can take as proof, as soon as they realized that Isabella had been thrown, that they went down with the children, also to the ground floor. This was refuted in an unquestionable way when Mr. Antonio Orozco calls COPM, which was at 11 p.m. He already has Alexander's presence down there, and because of Alexander's presence is that he gives information. Look, the child fell from the 6th floor. Until then he didn't know who that child was. Because Isabella didn't live in the building, he didn't know Isabella, he didn't know whose daughter she was. He only identified Isabella when he saw Alexander near the child's body. Then, Alexander started talking, as soon as he approached Isabella's body, about the thief's presence. Therefore, Alexander arrived right at the beginning of the call made by Mr. Antonio Lucio. In the record of the calls we have, made by the couple's landline phone, there is a call to Anna Jatoba's father, that she herself said she called her father, and this call starts practically 30 seconds after Mr. Antonio Lucio calls the military police. She speaks with her father, hangs up the phone and then calls her husband's number, speaks, hangs up the phone. So, how could she be down there and the phone being used inside the apartment? So, this was one of the points where we were able to unmask them and show that they were lying. Another thing they told in the first version they gave, first they went down the stairs, they said the door had been forced open, already at the police station. In the first statement on Sunday, they said, possibly someone used a copy of the key because the key was available at the doorman's desk, that they changed the door of the apartment, already the door that was in the other apartments when the building was delivered, so that from that moment on, the keys of these new doors were not available to the doorman's team. They could not keep these keys and somehow make a copy to later enter the apartment. Then Jatoba said that in fact, possibly whoever used the key to enter the apartment made a copy of the key that fell on the street, that she lost that key, she said. At one point she remembered after 18 days that she had lost a key, even giving a date, and that possibly the person who entered the apartment and found the key dropped not in some place where she lost it. At first, we already observed that blood dripping, it started at the entrance door of the apartment, going to the bedroom. The first bedroom is on the left, because there was no blood in the hallway, nor in the elevator, nor on the stairs that give access to the apartment. Knowing that the couple had arrived at the apartment with a certain car, the car also became an extension of the crime scene. The bloodstains indicated that this child had already entered injured, which is why she was not injured inside the apartment. On Sunday morning, Isabella's body had already been sent to the Legal Medical Institute, and the forensic experts in charge of carrying out the autopsy observed that there were other signs of violence and aggression, different from those of a fall from the 6th floor. What they observed were signs characteristic of asphyxia and, on the other hand, the signs related to the fall, throwing a child from the 6th floor, were not as exuberant, they were not as evident. Because of that, he asked to go to the scene, and was on his way to the IME on Sunday, March 30th, 2008, and as a habit, I called my colleague who was on duty. Is everything alright? And then the colleague went to look. There was only one case. At 5:20 a.m., a girl arrived with the summarized story of a fall from the 6th floor. But there is an investigator here wanting to know where the blood came from, the bleeding from the plane, the bleeding from the child. He wanted to know if it was from the forehead. The only visible lesion to the investigator was in the region of the forehead, and this is the day of the necropsy examination. Another possibility, another place. To see that bleeding, I was a little surprised. I thought I would find a pale child, not a fall from the 6th floor, a child who should have internal bleeding, paleness more than what caused me in this way. An experience was to find a purple child, cyanosis and face and ears, cyanosis, and so it was also generalized. The child's tongue was sticking out. It is not common with this type of trauma. We started there realizing that besides this fall there was another problem. There was another problem with the child. This injury to the forehead could have been caused, not the way it could. There was blood. I didn't know if it was blood because it was pulverized, if it was dripped, if there was blood force. This information is important to us, and these elements, like how the child was walking, if she was standing, being carried, etc., it's important to know. The traces of blood were the reason that motivated us to arrive at the conclusion that we should go to the crime scene and find out what caused that injury there, on the forehead. And in this first contact I had with them is that I learned that the child had been suffocated before being thrown, and that the injury to the forehead, that probably that lesion was what generated the blood inside the apartment. We would only know this later through the DNA test, and that experiment on the forehead. also had no relation to the fall. So, we were able to establish that this aggression started in the vehicle, inside the vehicle. Then for some reason this child was transported to the apartment, and this lesion was covered because there was no other stain until the entrance of the apartment, that piece that was compacted, which was probably the diaper. Because of the arrangement of the stains that existed in the diaper, it was not removed. And then the bloodstains begin, in the beginning, by the sequence of the bloodstains, until the window where she was thrown out the window. That, along with the marks of the screen that remained on the shirt, we were able to place the defendants in the crime scene actively, not passively. They lived there. At the beginning of the investigation, we already obtained the military police report with all the calls that were made to the military police and fire department, so we already had the exact time, the exact moment that Isabella had been thrown out the window, because the call was practically seconds after Isabella was thrown there on the grass. During the investigation, we obtained information where their vehicle had a tracker, and the tracker was installed on the day of the crime, on Saturday morning. Between the information, the exact time the engine was turned off at the address of the location, which is when they were in the garage, they turned off the engine, subtracting the time from the couple's arrival to the child's fall. 12 minutes and 26 seconds passed. To support their version, they said, "No, we stayed in the garage for a while. I went down to pick up my family. On the way back I didn't go straight to the apartment. We stayed in the car for a while because another car came in with the volume of the music loud and I was afraid of waking up the children." People stayed in the garage for a while, considering the minimum possible for a human being to go up, go down, wait for the elevator to open the door, etc. The minimum would be approximately 19 minutes, and the maximum time that everything happened was 12 minutes and 26 seconds. Simply all the time of your version does not fit in any way in the time that was officially proven. Since the first meeting I had with the forensic experts, they were already reviewing all the injuries observed in the victim, and from these injuries we started to put together the dynamics of how the crime happened. The child, then she was a victim of an aggression on the forehead. She was suffocated before. She suffered several types of injuries from aggressions. What we call the conclusion, that this child, she was thrown to the floor of the apartment and not from the 6th floor. There was a fracture at the end of the forearm bone, the radius, when there is no this type of impacted fracture, which is when the bone enters the other end, is that she fell with her hand extended, with hyperextension of the hand, as an instinctive reflex of protection. She fell backwards, with her hand extended and with her arm extended, and fractured the bone, because she was applying force on the extension of the hand, with the arm extended. Fracture of the radius, here at the wrist. The impact that caused this fracture was from the palm of the hand to the inside of the arm. I have already reached the conclusion that this fracture was caused by the victim's fall inside the apartment, and she necessarily had to be alive. Because it is a type of defensive lesion. When the child is going to fall, the person is going to fall instinctively. She makes a defensive movement with her arms, with her hand to support herself. It is common in autopsy for the forensic expert to examine the victim's clothing, and I observed then that there was the presence of vomit in the anterior region of her shirt. The vomit shows that she was in an upright position and she was lying on her stomach, because if the vomit did not reach that anterior region, she would also not be on her side for the vomit to come out of her mouth and fall in that region at the time she was in that position. She was sitting or standing. The forensic experts also informed me that this lesion in the wrist would not have been caused by the fall because she did not fall sitting down. If she was quiet, sitting on the 6th floor, she would necessarily have some kind of lesion in the cervical spine, and she did not present any lesion, so they already concluded that the lesion was before the fall and that she arrived alive, because otherwise she wouldn't have had the lesion. This instinctive defense, see how important it is to have a precise analysis of the bloodstains, so not only the shape now, folks, but also the amount. So, All this dynamics, this sequence of stains, which indicates the planting, so it started at the door jamb. We have a whole sequence through the room, through the corridor, until the window where she was thrown out the window. At the moment, it is not specific to this path. We found a larger amount of stains, and these stains indicated that the victim would be sitting there, at the height she was projected, right? And that, along with the stains I found on the clothes, specifically on the shorts she was wearing, indicated that she was sitting here with her legs crossed. She fell sitting down because this type of iliac fracture, the ilium is part of the hip bone, the pelvis, which is a curved bone. There are two small arches, one on each side. It's where we lean, we sit, and the orthopedist knows this very well, that when there's a fracture of this arch, if the arched bone is in the region, in the gluteal region, we enter. What usually happens is that the person falls sitting down. It is characteristic in most cases of iliac fracture, or it is a very large fracture. When you fall from a great height, of a lot of energy, you can fracture it, but this fracture is very small. There was only a small trace of fracture on the right side, showing then that she was sitting, but without much impact, without much violence, without much energy. It's the energy of the child's own weight. But to have this type of fracture, there would have to be something else besides the force of gravity. There was another force that added to the force of gravity to cause a greater force, enough to cause this fracture. At that moment, she had already suffered 3 more injuries due to this throw on the floor. So, she was much more stiff. Possibly she had started to scream. She complained in some way, and then there was asphyxia. During the autopsy we found that the child had suffered asphyxia, one of the modalities of asphyxia, this protrusion of the tongue, the type of cyanosis, skin lesions in the posterior region of the neck. There was a hematoma with signs of compression there, from the fingertips. Internally there were hemorrhagic infiltrations in some parts of the neck. Characteristics of asphyxia, of manual compression, of the conditions that the forensic experts considered, of the lesions she presented, both inside the mouth and later the lesions due to this throwing from inside the apartment. She did not have any defensive movement. She did not have the conditions. The conclusion is that this scream heard by 2 people, the other son of the couple. The asphyxia in the way it was produced, if there had been no emergency care, as there was not, that would fatally cause death, just from the asphyxia. From the moment the diaper was seized, it was done through the analysis of reagents on that tissue and checking if there was blood. So we already knew that if there was blood in that place, possibly in that place, at that crime scene, there could have been blood in other parts of the apartment that were not visible to the naked eye. So it was necessary to carry out a supplementary expertise to identify any blood marks that were cleaned, and the specialist also, this expertise with the chemical reagent called Blue Star, identified a larger blood mark near the arm of the sofa in the living room, and where possibly she was thrown. In that place she had those 2 fractures, and heard the dripping from the forehead, which is the injury she had, and make a larger blood mark in that place, which was later cleaned before being thrown, and that part of that blood was removed, and it was only possible to find out through Blue Star. The couple themselves informed that they arrived at the apartment with a certain car, so an expertise was carried out on this car, and they informed where each person was sitting inside this vehicle. Isabella was sitting behind the driver's seat. Whoever was driving the car was Alexander. An examination was done on this car, and through the chemical reagent, blood was detected in this car. The treatment in the place where they themselves told us where Isabella was, by the location of the stains. I already knew that the victim could only be sitting in the back seat, right? Right behind the driver's seat, because of the location of the stains. Probably the father was driving, the stepmother in the passenger seat next to her and the children in the back, with the victim only being able to be sitting directly behind the driver. It was possible to identify, in addition to human blood, blood with Isabella's genetic profile, which was recent blood, because she had a cut on her forehead. This cut has no relation to the fall from the 6th floor, so the first conclusion we arrive at here, this cut was made already inside the vehicle itself, because it was the only injury with bleeding and there was no recent Isabella's blood in the car. This blood was from this cut on the forehead. Because of the arrangement of the people in the car, the conclusion we arrive at is that Anna Carolina, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, in some movement she made back to reprimand the children for some reason, because she herself said that on the way the son who was in the car seat was crying non-stop, so when trying to stop, for some reason, she caused the injury with some instrument that we don't know what it is, generating the cut on Isabella's forehead, and then the car was stopped in the garage. From the garage to the apartment, no blood drop was found. Even doing a chemical test, we didn't find anything, so if she had a bleeding and this blood is not seen in this path, then we have the conclusion that this blood was stopped with tissue. Somehow, she was being carried in her arms, this blood was stopped, and because of her age, because of her size, she was definitely ing carried by Alexander, not by Jatoba, because she had a baby in her arms that she needed to carry, and Alexander's hand, along with the handkerchief. It was possible at the same time that he was stopping the blood from the forehead injury. It was possible to cover the child's mouth so that people wouldn't hear the child cry, scream. She had injuries in her mouth, in the mucosa of her mouth, in her tongue, and this may have been caused by a compression of the mouth region. The same hand that was holding the forehead, in conversation, may be trying to silence the child. From the moment the family enters the apartment, this blood is no longer necessary. This blood is already removed. This tissue, in this case, may be the diaper. And then this dripping that is compatible with Isabella's height being carried by Alexander, because the distance from one drop to another is the distance of an adult's step, and also that she, in the area of the blood drops, you can say that that person is static, she is not fighting, and she is walking, but she is holding the person, and she is static, not fighting. So, through this analysis of this blood, we already have this crime scene, the child being carried in her arms inside the apartment. The couple was invited to participate in the reconstruction. It was a way for them to tell what they did in the apartment and to explain, to be more clear, and this was also reproduced, so it was an opportunity they had to show their version. They refused to appear. It was their right. They even said they would not provide evidence against themselves. The reconstruction helps a lot in visualizing the dynamics, so that we can effectively analyze their versions, whether they are viable or not. But when we get to this part of the experiment, it has to be a controlled environment. I can't do it there, at the scene, during a reproduction. Here we have several people, the actors who are participating in the reproduction. For an experiment to have technical validation, I have to control several variables, or at least the most important ones. For having technical validation, it is not possible to do a simulated reproduction. The marks that existed on the front face of the shirt, which was Alexander's shirt, that he was wearing on the day of the crime, were perfectly visible to the naked eye. It is evident. For 18, it is wrong, isn't it? A forensic expert's look, but they were visible. There was no need to use any type of equipment, reagent or anything. Now, it is evident that it is not enough to just observe, so I observed this mark, so I need to explain how they were made. This is the specialist's job, and we did this through experiments, where the egg, the control of a series of variables, the same screen. We did some tests with shirts of the same brand, of the same type of fabric print. They had a forensic model with the same characteristics of the defendant to be able to do the tests, or through these marks, in this removal of dirt that we found on the external face of the building, it was possible to arrive at the dynamics of how she was thrown out the window. First she released her left hand, made a pendulum movement, leaving this removal, and then she continued. Her right hand was released, and then she left another type of mark. And then, with the pediatric mannequin, we can demonstrate how this was done. The investigation work lasted 30 days, where we heard 67 witnesses, who work in crimes against people. He has to be very aware of the responsibility he has, because it is the work of the legal expert. He can exonerate or condemn someone. He has to be very aware, especially in crimes against people, because we are not dealing only with that life that was lost, but with the lives of all the other people who are directly or indirectly connected to that case. So it is a very important moment, a moment of great responsibility, commitment. The moment I finished the report, I knew what the outcome would be, so I was aware, and I also knew that it was a job that I would have to defend to the end, and it was possible at the end of this investigation, without direct witnesses, to put this puzzle together and effectively show what happened in the crime, thanks to a work of dedication, competence, effort of all the professionals who worked in it, working from morning to night, at dawn, weekends without ceasing. Only in this way were we able to reach the end of the investigation on the last day with the work carried out.